Hello, hello. Just a moment. I want to put up notices that I'm streaming. I should do that more consistently. So, grab the URL. And then copy that over to the Casa Grande Discord because they have a self promotion tab. No, not streamy young. Streaming. Okay, we can get started. As Sena's presence faded away, the study's atmosphere steadily began to drift. Let's see. Now, where were we? We had completed the day's chores, and it was time to go to the study and look at all the notes. A dark, grim cloud of memories seemed to hang over the room, specters of unending nights and restless sleep. Although Esther couldn't pinpoint exactly why, she had the distinct sense that this chamber belonged to a deeply troubled mind. Because she also saw the flashback where she saw him being troubled and shit. Clutching a candle in one hand, she started to scan through the shelves, her eyes flicking across numerous titles. Sina was right. Her father really had collected a staggering assortment of books. But as she glanced over the various titles before her, Esther noticed something unusual. Despite Isaiah's obvious focus on alchemy, there seemed to be almost as many books on ghosts and spirits, and a number of treatises on the supernatural. Were they related to his search for a cure at all? Or was there some other reason for his apparent obsession? Well, first game, you're gonna have to tell me if ghosts are real in this world. Esther couldn't understand how ghosts might be related to the Pales, so maybe he'd simply found them interesting to research. Like, if there's compelling evidence on the existence of ghosts in this world, then maybe, I'm sick with some mysterious disease. Science will definitely care. I mean, if there's ghosts, ghosts ain't care about science. Still, the anomaly stuck out in her mind, leaving her with a nagging set of questions. Like, if I were in her situation, right? If I were in Esther's situation, I'd be like, oh, all this supernatural stuff. I get it. Desperation and whatnot. But I can probably safely ignore that. Like, when you're dying, you'll turn to anything, of course. But, I don't know. In this world, is this realistic Earth? Maybe. But also, even if this is realistic Earth, of course, this is also periods long past. It's not clear exactly how old it is, but, like, there's stagecoaches and the house is warmed with a fireplace. It's ye olden times of some sort. Probably 1800s. And so, yeah, I mean, supernatural belief is going to be a lot higher then. But still. At least if this were happening today, I would dismiss all of the supernatural stuff as like, I get it, he's desperate. I'm not going to judge, but I'm also not going to read that. As she opened up a large book on biology, suddenly a loose leaf of parchment fluttered out. Girls, girls, girls! Ugh. Esther bent down to pick it up, turning the aged paper over in her hands. It looked like a journal entry, but there was no date to be found. Curiously squinting at the messy script, Esther brought it over to the nearest lamp and began to read. He says yawn. Ugh, I'm so bad about that. 7 days have passed since Amaranth left me. 3 days since Jeremiah is a good name, told me that he saw her with another man, her previous husband, now miraculously returned from his absence. I cannot eat, I cannot sleep. My heart bounds with manic energy between rage and this crushing sense of abandonment. I don't know why I made him southern, I just did. In the depths of my darkest moods, I look back on her long months of her pregnancy, months I spent on carpentry, furnishing, cleaning, planting, remaking this dusty tomb of an estate into a family manor. All for her, All because she could never stand life in the dreadful city. And where is she now? Back in his chambers, no doubt, embracing him in the darkness so that she might hide the shameful stretch marks of her maternity. If a woman has starch masks on her body, does that mean she's been pregnant before? Damn her, that sycophantic wretch. Damn her and her lecherous, adulterous bastard of a husband. Oh, how I used to wonder what such a beautiful soul as her might have seen in a waste of flesh like him. But now with the veil lifted from my eyes, I finally understand. They are alike, two souls perfectly matched in their shallowness and fickle attentions. All the girls want bad boys, and I'm a nice guy, and The Matrix is a good movie. What a ridiculous fool I was, ever believing that she might come to truly care for a penniless researcher with a giant house, one with nothing to offer her but himself and the giant house. And now what am I left with? A giant house, a small child, and no mother to raise it, an old family home, and no family to fill its many chambers. A retirement from my life in medicine, without anything worthy left to retire for. No, I refuse. I refuse to let her triumph over me. I will remain here, away from that toxic conurbation. Yeah, that's a word I don't know. Isolated among the fruits of my sweat and labor. With these foundations I have laid in the land, I know I can survive solely by myself, without recourse to the city's indulgent pleasures. Here amidst my tomes and papers, these books which are worth a considerable amount of money in this day and age, because the printing press, while a thing, is still very, very slow. I will press onward in my research towards the last and most important focus of my life, counting the number of times we use the word towards. I believe it is now at 13. A cure for this disease. And as for the little girl, we look nothing alike, she and I. Indeed, now that I am privy to her mother's treachery, I suspect her father may be another man entirely. The little hairs on her head are purely golden, and everything from her eyes to her lips is nothing but a bitter replica of that woman's features. I went from Southern Gentleman to Zap Brannigan. She even has the self-same twinkling, uncaring laugh. Oh, and it went from confident to uncaring, as if the world could never touch her nor dare to make her cry. The very thought irritates me to no end. Also, the very thought irritates him to no end. I cannot bear the sight of her, an unending reminder of the future that was stolen from me. Thus I am resolved. I will take the girl to the city and leave her in the hands of the orphanage there. A less cruel fate, no doubt, than to remain forever imprisoned with an unloving father. In the end, I know I could truly never amount to anything more for her. Oh, I found all the bad things I did.txt in this book. How convenient. How helpful. As Esther's eyes drifted across the page's last words, she felt a strange, uncomfortable sense of guilt in her chest. The girl he was talking about. He had to have meant Sana. Did he really feel so bitterly towards her? 14. Obviously, Isaiah hadn't taken his daughter to an orphanage, but his resentment in her sounded deep-rooted. It felt invasive and overly intimate to be reading his private thoughts, or maybe he did bring that daughter to an orphanage and Sana is someone else. Who knows? But did she really have much choice, if there was any chance Isaiah's writings hinted at a cure? She had to go through everything, including his journals, in case he mentioned any important research. Sana, don't look through my books. It contains my dirty secrets. My dirty, unloving secrets that I refuse to throw out, I guess. Gotta keep it around in case someone wants to know. Otherwise, there was a very good chance she'd miss something. Tucking the journal page away, she hastily pushed the book back into its shelf. Now she was even more glad that she decided to search alone. Some parts of the past were better off remaining buried, it seems. Oh my god, I've spent this entire time without moving to the game. Whoopsie. At least I was being recorded. Whoops. Whoops, that's embarrassing. What you missed was Esther looking sad and text crawling on screen. Uh, Attempting to banish the journal page from her mind, Esther combed through a few stacks of papers and books lying around the study, scanning through them in an attempt to glean any useful information. But her exhaustion from the day's work, along with the esoteric, erudite nature of Isaiah's research, made it increasingly difficult to concentrate. Perhaps she was better off returning the next day, when presumably she'd have more energy to scan over things. Come back the next day, after the chores again, and you're tired again. Leaving the study with a faint sense of disappointment, Esther made her way down to the kitchen, where she could hear Sena working happily away. She prepared a rich, hearty vegetable stew for their supper, and a delicious pot of tea to accompany it. And a couple cans of... As night fell, they shared their meal at the little kitchen table, warmed by the nearby cozy hearth. Unlike their adjective lunch, Sena kept up a lively, mostly one-sided conversation all the while, as if she'd suddenly thought of 100 more things to say in Esther's absence. Still, it felt so comfortable, somehow. The normal pressure of acting sociable didn't seem to apply around Sena, who seemed content just to share Esther's presence, even if the older girl rarely spoke. Yeah, how much older? How old is Sena? A peace Esther had only felt before when she was alone. How unfamiliar it all was. She's at least 6. That's a good point. Because everything happened 6 years ago. Esther? Esther, are you alright? After they'd finished washing the dishes and wandered back to the parlor, Sena gave Esther a curious, slightly worried look. I think you could use some rest. You look really, really tired. You did work very hard today. She couldn't deny Sena's observation. It was becoming steadily more of a struggle keeping her eyes open, and her muscles ached from so much unexpected use. You're right. I should sleep, so I'll have the energy to go through the study more properly tomorrow. You should rest too, Sena. Yes, of course. We should be able to go through the chores more quickly tomorrow, too, since you're an expert now. Well, I'll see you in the morning then, Esther. Sleep well. After pausing for a short moment, she gave a playful little curtsy with a smile, to which Esther nodded in response. But as she started to turn towards the stairs, 15, Sena hesitated again, glancing back at Esther somewhat shyly. Esther? You probably aren't very comfortable, right? I mean, wearing your normal day clothes to sleep. I sleep in the nude. Don't look. The thought had barely crossed her mind, but Sena was right. Her traveling outfit wasn't exactly the most pleasant thing to rest in. I think you're too big for any of my clothes, but if you like, I could give you one of Papa's old shirts to wear at night. He was really tall, so it would be like a nightgown for you. Only if it's no trouble. No, not at all. Just, if you're going to be staying here for a little while, it makes sense, doesn't it? You can't be wearing the same thing all the time. I can, and the artist will make sure that I will. Anyway, I'll be right back. Stay there just a moment. Taking off in what was almost a sprint, she bounded over to the stairs, vanishing up them the next moment. Esther barely had to wait a minute before she heard returning footsteps and spotted Sena fluttering through the foyer like a white rabbit. And here we are! She unfurled a huge black shirt from beneath her arm, flourishing it like a grand cape. Esther tentatively reached out for the shirt. Even though it was probably silly of her, she couldn't shake a sense of guilt, agreeing to wear something that belonged to a person so recently deceased. 6 years ago! Sena's father, no less. Well, you can go change in the kitchen if you'd like. I'll wait here. The same feeling didn't seem to bother Sena, who gave Esther an eager, nearly impatient smile. All right. After a brief pause, she relented, moving to retreat into the kitchen. It was quite chilly away from the fire, so Esther undressed quickly, goosebumps rising on her arms as soon as she unbuttoned her blouse. Once her clothes were hastily folded up beside her, she pulled the shirt over her head, immediately thankful for the loose warmth it provided. How does it look? She wandered back into the living room, hesitantly shifting her gaze over to Sena. The soft, loose fabric hung over Esther's frame like an oversized dress, her arms lost in the flowing sleeves. It smelled remarkably clean. Sena must have kept washing her father's clothes all these years. Ah, wow! It really suits you, Esther, just like a cozy nightgown. Sena gasped with delight, clasping her hands together and beaming brightly. You weren't lying about it being big. She raised one arm to study her dangling sleeve, feeling somewhat embarrassed about how ridiculous she must have looked. Still, she had to admit, it was much cozier than her blouse and skirt. It also made Esther feel a little more at home, instead of a wanderer simply staying overnight. Thank you, Sena. I promise I'll take good care of it. Aw, you don't need to be so formal, Esther. It's only a shirt. But I'm happy you like it. Papa was always very practical, so I think he'd be glad to know his clothes are being put to good use again. A gentle smile. So many types of smiles. A gentle smile crossed Sena's features, carrying a trace of both sadness and warm affection. Well, now that you've got something nicer to sleep in, I suppose it's bedtime. Good night, Esther. Sleep well. Excuse me. Good night, Sena. So when does Sena, start drinking Esther's blood or something? This mysterious, vagrant child? Thank you again. Thank you again. When they parted ways and Sena's bedroom door had softly clicked shut upstairs, Esther lowered herself into the couch once more. It was her second night here, but already it was starting to feel like something of a pleasant routine. Pleasant. It's, if not for what always had to preface her sleep. Reaching down for where her satchel still rested on the floor, Esther pulled out the small silver watch from before. Reluctantly but methodically, she flicked the switch and pushed the needle into her arm, siphoning out her blood before forcing the altered compound back into her vein. Around and around the hand spun until they marked a full day's worth of hours. Yuck! The syringe slipped free from her skin, leaving only a few beads of deep red behind. It was difficult to describe the strange, sickly discomfort she felt during and after the process. At first there was a modicum of relief, a pleasant buzz that distracted her from the injection. But within a few moments it swiftly turned into a nauseating weight in the pit of her stomach, a feeling like something alien and unwanted had begun circling in her bloodstream. She had to keep doing it for now. One day she'd no longer be dependent on the loathsome thing, but she could only dream of when that day would finally come. It sounds like a metaphor for borrowed time. Curling her legs up on the sofa, Esther huddled beneath her blankets. She felt far more comfortable in Isaiah's shirt, at least, though it hardly mattered, considering how deeply tired she was. I need to go blow my nose. I will be... Okay. Before long, the warmth of a well-deserved sleep began to drown out all her thoughts. The weight on her mind steadily cleared, fading into a muddy haze, until at last she was pulled into the timeless world of dreams. How are there so many of these accursed things? Wiping the sweat from his brow with the forearm, the man sighed heavily. He was only halfway through planting his potatoes, one of the staple crops he'd planned. They were taking him much longer than expected, and it was far from an enjoyable process. With all the work I put into this patch, I expect some damn fine produce to come out of it, he announced sharply to the fresh-tilled earth around him, which currently only offered a few sparse seedlings. Still, despite all of his annoyance and grumbling, Isaiah couldn't deny the satisfaction he felt from surveying his work. Between the garden and the newly renovated manor, his old family grounds are becoming a beautiful, independent refuge in the forest. At last, he would be free from the will of others, free from all the rules, structures, and arbitrary games of society. Oh, he's one of those sovereign citizen ass. It was well worth the price of being completely alone. Well, not entirely alone. Isaiah's gaze flicked towards 16, the small figure sitting in the grass nearby, toying with flowers and giggling with wonder at the sky. The scene was one he'd longed for so many times. Only in his dreams she was here too, laughing and holding their child, the sunlight glittering on their matching hair. Without her, it seemed like nothing more than a sad joke, the caricature of a clueless father played for a fool by his beloved. But we don't want to draw her, because that takes time and money. And what a fool I am, he muttered bitterly to himself, tossing his shovel aside and rubbing a hand across his brow. Stuck with a child I have no clue how to care for. Out here gardening and laboring, when I'm nothing but a witless academic who inadvertently slew all of his houseplants by forgetting to water them. I've gotten myself into quite the mess this time, haven't I? His chest heaved with a long, tired sigh. As much as he tried to convince himself this was the right choice, that he'd be happier out here than in the city, a sense of doubt always came creeping back to him. And like it had for so many years, the pail's icy grip still held him in its clutches. Earlier in the year, when he was cleaning and refurbishing the manor for his new family, Isaiah had barely felt the symptoms. A wealth of energy flowed through him, and all of his lethargy was washed away by tides of excitement. But now, he couldn't rouse himself from bed half the time, and the disease attacked him savagely when he least expected it. His last true hope for living, the only thing giving him the will to fight the Pale's onslaught, was his search for a cure. Though he could feel that hope beginning to wane too. Papa. The man jerked his head towards 17, the source of that tiny voice. He kept forgetting she was even there, playing among the flowers. But when he looked down at the child, he saw her tiny hand outstretched towards him, 17. A little white blossom lay in the center of her palm, offered up to him alongside a sunny, guileless smile. That's like the 6th or so smile that she's had. Reluctantly, the man lowered down to one knee. With hesitant, uncertain fingers, he reached out to take her offering, holding it in his much larger palm. Hee. Papa, Papa. The girl delightedly clapped her hands, breaking into a happy fit of giggles. Isaiah watched her for several long moments, his face contorting slightly, as if it wasn't fully sure what expression to make. It makes this expression. What a silly girl. Like a damned babbling brook you are. Silence is a virtue, especially for children. Yeah, that sounds like the 1800s. Grumbling quietly, he shoved the white flower into his pocket, then reached out to pick up his shovel once more. There was still a great deal of planting to be done. He had to take advantage of days like today, when he had strength to work properly. No time to be playing around with flowers, certainly. Pout, pout, pout. I'm sad. Because my wife, or not even his wife. He was the affair, right? That Sena's mother, Sena's mother was married and had an affair with Isaiah, And Isaiah was basically upset that she went back to her husband. With that, he set about digging again, driving his shovel into the soft earth with vehement strikes. What a strange life he had created for himself. Strange, solitary, and most likely, a very difficult one indeed. There was much he had to learn, and not simply for academic curiosity, but for their survival. It was a heavy pressure, unforgiving and merciless as nature itself. Nor was he a young, fit man full of vigorous energy any longer, able to finish 100 tasks in one day. But somehow he couldn't imagine going back to how life was before. Even if he never became a skilled farmer or a decent carpenter or an adept tailor, at least he was forging his path with his own 2 hands. As long as he retained that endless freedom, cherished it, grew bolder in it, and one day perhaps even passed it down to her, he could surely carry any weight on his shoulders along the way. A distant rumble stirred Esther from her sleep. Her hazy, half-open eyes drifted towards the window 18, where a dull gray sky greeted her with a little morning light. Dark, heavy drop... God, the adjective vomit is... The exuberant adjective vomit. Green with color and... like, Jesus Christ. Sometimes you can just say a noun. Sometimes you can just use a noun. Sluggishly coursed down the glass, forming jagged patterns that soon dissolved into nothingness. Like, I don't know how all those adjectives read to, like, I mean, a non-English major, right? But it's grating to me. The grayness brought her back memories of the city. Dim, cold dawns filtering through her bedroom window. Minutes spent staring out past the smoking chimneys into the industrial fog that always clouded her view. Mornings where it felt like an immense struggle to will herself upward, to muster the strength for starting a new day. She could hear her parents down below, their muffled voices greeting each other cheerfully over tea and breakfast. But as much as she dearly wanted to join them, the longer she lay there listening to their light chatter, the more she felt removed from them altogether. A sense of loneliness so deep that it grew complacent, resigned to the fact that she would never again rejoin the unafflicted world. Yeah, it hasn't really been established yet whether the pale is contagious or not, or even if people of this age understand contagion. And the more she dwelled on that sullen thought, the less Esther felt like she wanted to rejoin such a world at all. Like, I know they understood contagion in some forms, why, like, lepers were exiled, is because people were afraid of catching it. Like, they understood catching disease, but not necessarily the way in which it happens. Like, they wouldn't understand the difference between airborne, waterborne, based on touch, things like that. I don't know if miasma theory was still the prevalent theory of medicine at around this time, but the idea was that sick people or sickness creates bad air that when breathed will make you sick, which is like not that far from airborne transmission, but it also totally disregards the chance for something like waterborne illness, which is why cholera was such an issue at the time, because cholera is waterborne. And people with cholera were often, say, sequestered in their homes or whatever, but they were still dumping their waste, which was getting into the water and poisoning whole towns. And eventually, someone figured this out and how to counteract it. I don't know where the story goes from there. Until finally a restless sleep slowly would come over to cover her in darkness once more. Oh, excuse me. Esther, are you awake? Said a voice. Her eyelids fluttered open again. I mean, it was probably Sena. When she jerked her head upwards, she saw Sena sitting beside the sofa, looking down at her rather timidly. Oh, I'm so sorry if I woke you up. I just thought I'd make some tea, so I was checking if I should put a bigger pot for the two of us. Despite her light smile, that's like the seventh smile, something in Seina's tone seemed to carry a hint of worry. Almost automatically, Esther slowly pushed herself into a sitting position. She barely realized it until her bare feet brushed the floor, sending a faint shiver up her spine. It's fine. I was already awake. Thank you for checking on me. Oh, of course. Seina looked relieved, nodding contently to Esther's words. Tea for two, then. I'll go put on the kettle. Oh, and I thought we could stay inside today. I normally do on rainy days. We could go over Papa's books and research together, maybe, if I wouldn't bother you. What's in that book? A leaflet falls out that just says, I hate my daughter. Oh, nothing. I'd be grateful for your help, Seina. There are so many books and papers. I barely know where to start. Yes, of course. I'd be happy to help. I'm so excited. But first things first, the tea. I'll go fix a pot that's perfect for a day like this. If you don't mind, could you start the fire and light a few candles, Esther? There's a tinderbox in the desk by the window. That's the sound of a fire line in RuneScape. You attempt to light a fire. With that, she turned to hurry off into the kitchen, and the soft pattering of her footsteps buried beneath the drone of heavy rain. Sean, Jason. Again, in an unconscious movement, Esther found herself rising from her nest of blankets with little effort. It caught her off guard. Normally, her illness left her all but catatonic on overcast days. Perhaps her self-consciousness around Seina was an even stronger force than her deep lethargy. Either way, it seemed best not to question it. After changing into her day clothes and fishing out the tinderbox that Seina mentioned, Esther knelt down to kindle the fireplace. Fire making level 36. As soon as it flickered to life, filling the room with a warm light and steady crackling, she felt like a spark of energy lit inside her too. So strange how only a small fire could make such a difference. When Seina returned, she proudly held a fine silver tray in her hands. Along with tea, she'd brought 2 bowls of the granola she'd freshly made, a deliciously comforting breakfast alongside their warm drinks. They sat down on the sofa to munch together, watching the rain torrent down in sheets past the window pane. It was one of those heavy, blanketing storms that made a person grateful to have shelter, nurturing some deep instinct to curl up inside and wait for the rain to pass. Sitting together for an unhurried meal, reassured by a warm fire and pattering raindrops that all was safe. It was a simple pleasure, but the more she dwelled on it, the more Esther found a calm, reassuring satisfaction in the moment. You can just say satisfaction. Oh. At one point, Seina giggled faintly, to which Esther gave her a puzzled glance. You were making a really cute, charming face just now. Like a little cat after it just finished a saucer of cream. That cat's gonna shit. Esther hastily raised her mug and took a long sip of tea, taking refuge behind the painted ceramic. Oh, I'm not teasing you. I know I make funny faces too. It just makes me happy to see you like this, since when you first arrived, you were all like, sourpuss, frown, frown. You looked so hollow. Hollow? Seina nodded, lowering her gaze to where she grasped her warm mug in both hands. Yes, hollow. Like you didn't have anything left, I suppose. From her suddenly reluctant, almost wary reply, it almost seemed as if she was familiar with such a look. She could have been imagining things, but Esther thought she saw Seina shudder faintly, drawing closer to the fireplace. Well, since we're both finished, I think I'll go wash up. She hopped to her feet, stacking their bowls together atop the tray. Alright, I'll go upstairs and look for some books to bring down. Oh yes, you can light candles up there if you want, since it's so dark. I'll meet you back here in a bit, then. With that, Sana swiveled to make her way towards the kitchen. 19? Her tray rattling softly. Her retreat seemed a little hastier than normal. Esther had the sense that she was still bothered by something. Perhaps the comment she'd made earlier about looking hollow. Despite her warm friendliness, Sana had a certain guarded side to her, a private shield and degree of separation that Esther hadn't expected. You know, if you were confident in your writing, you would let that speak for itself. Like, yeah, no, don't worry. I picked up on the fact that she's kind of hiding something. You don't have to tell me that she's hiding something. Have confidence. No confidence. It might fade eventually if they grew to know each other better. But right now, Esther felt like Satan was almost keeping her at arm's length in a strange way. After summoning the strength required to leave the warm, cozy fire, Esther forced herself out into the hallway and up the creaky stairs. The adjectives are exhausting. But when she stepped into the study, just like before, Esther felt an oppressive, bleak atmosphere pressing down around her. Oh, don't worry, I feel it too. In her haste to light one of the candles, she nearly tripped over her own 2 feet. Her own 3 feet. Oh no! Their glow didn't wholly alleviate the grim darkness, but it was enough to bring Esther a little relief. Why did this room bother her so much? By all accounts, it simply looked like a normal study, albeit a very messy one. There was nothing that should have set her on edge. Exhaling a long sigh, she inwardly mocked herself for her cowardice. She was here to find a cure, not to get caught up in her silly fear of shadows. But the more she glanced around the small library with its overflowing shelves and piles of scattered books and paper, the more daunting her task felt. The only real trail of research that Isaiah left were his scattered writings. And of course, there's absolutely no guarantee that any of those books contain something useful. Uncovering his studies would have been far easier if they were bound together, not written on individual scraps of parchment. However, if Isaiah went through the phase of studying different subjects, perhaps the journal pages stuffed into similar books would be from roughly the same period of his life. I would start from the end then, if you could. With that hope in mind, Esther returned to the spot she'd previously found the journal. She found the previous journal entry, scouring intensely over the row of dusty tomes. It didn't take long for her to spot another piece of parchment, this one tucked inside a small leather book. My daughter is a dork. Yeah, I figured. Eagerly pulling it from the shelf, she let the tome fall open in her palms, revealing a short page scribbled in Isaiah's hand. Yeah, also, well, I need to find his notes. His last notes were about how he felt embarrassed by having a daughter with the woman he had an affair with. And that she might not be his daughter. That was all about her, not about the pail at all. Oh, I think it said something and I wasn't looking. She baffles me, that little girl. Always laughing, always cheerful. Always smiling and patient with me, even after I raise my voice at her. I've only seen her cry once. It happened when I brought her outside this morning, preparing to bring her to the city's orphanage. And as if she somehow knew our destination, the girl instantly began to bawl and scream, a dreaded sound that I should hope never to hear again. The sound of children screaming has been edited out. So dreadful, in fact, that I could not stomach the thought of hearing it for hours, so I was forced to cancel my trip. I don't want to go. Fine. I suppose I will keep her here for now. When she gets older, she may be useful at cleaning and tending the land with me, at least. With any luck, she will have inherited my work ethic instead of her mother's. This doesn't help at all. Excuse me. Isaiah had mentioned taking Sana to an orphanage in the last journal she'd read. The two entries must have been written very close together. Her hunch was right. The discovery made her heart leap with excitement, even though it was only a very small revelation. If she could piece together Isaac's path of study chronologically as well as his inner thoughts, She might have a chance of figuring out his approach to a cure. By bitching about his daughter. That's how you do it. Yeah? A small note suddenly fluttered out from the back of the book, startling Esther. As she bent down to grab it, her eyes drifting over the scribbled writing. A reminder, finish reading and annotating the latest tome on spirits. Any relation to the Pale still seems unlikely, but if all my alchemical and biological studies have been fruitless, what have I to lose? I'm gonna give Isaiah like 20 different voices. She turned the book over to glance at its cover and spine, but there was no name to be seen. Ghost title! However, when she opened to the first page, it went, Boo! A large title stretched across the parchment in sharp letters. Salmevith, a treatise on spirits of shadow. Spirits of shadow. For some reason, as she murmured part of the title aloud to herself, Esther felt a faint chill crawling up her spine. It was only a book on superstition and unfounded claims, surely. But if Isaiah had singled it out, maybe it was still worth scanning through. Wasting not a minute further, she scooped up some of the surrounding books and loose papers on the shelf, cradling them carefully in her arms. But before she left, she had to quickly blow out all the candles, and once the gloomy darkness returned, it seemed even deeper than before. We call this one a leisurely pace. Once she descended the stairs and returned to the warmly lit parlor, Esther exhaled a quiet sigh of relief. Sana was already waiting on the sofa, huddled up beneath a large, fluffy red blanket. I need to blow my nose again. Hello. Hello, Esther. Welcome back. Ah, look at all those books. Here, I'll help you. She sprung off the cushions eagerly, as if Esther's return was a welcome relief for her, too. Together they stacked up the books and papers at one end of the sofa, reforming a rather intimidating pile. Sana, however, didn't seem fazed in the slightest by the tower of texts, and bent down to examine the titles curiously. Natural sciences, astronomy, alchemy. I don't think I've seen any of these before. Oh, wait. This book. I remember this one. Spooky Ghosties. Sana reached for the same book Esther had picked up first, the book on spirits. Yes, Papa was always reading this book and scribbling notes. It's actually about alcohol. I asked him about it again and again, but he never told me why he was so obsessed with it. I guess he thought it would frighten me too much. With a soft sigh, she sank back down into the sofa, still holding the book with a certain reverence. When Esther settled in beside her, Sana reached out to drape the blanket around the other girl's shoulder. Is it just me, or are Sana's eyes a little too detailed? Thank you. It's cozy. Isn't it? Reading is a lot better when you're wrapped in a blanket. Well then, let's see what Papa was fussing over so much. Are you ready? Reading rainbow. Holding the book up so that Esther could see the pages, Sana began to read aloud, focusing on the pages her father had scribbled on the most. Before long, both of them were equally transfixed. In a strange blend of psychology, philosophy, and the supernatural, the author described how different spirits affected one's body and mind in different ways. The term spirits didn't refer solely to departed souls, but rather certain essences of the universe that manifested in concentrated forms. Some could be channeled for purposes like healing, luck, or creative inspiration, but most couldn't be controlled by humans. They would simply pass through the body of their own accord, or as dictated by other factors in the environment. However, as fascinating as it was to consider, Esther listened with a skeptical detachment. With no proof beyond his own research and anecdotal evidence, the author's claims could hardly rival any real scientific study. And more importantly, Esther couldn't see any real relation to the Pale, at least not in a way that would help her find a cure. Just as she was about to suggest they try a different book, Sana turned to a new chapter. It only lasted a single page, and the page after it was completely blank. Chapter 33, How to Cure the Pale. A short warning on the study of the Araphel. When her eyes roamed across the title, a small shiver ran through her body, just like it had earlier. Such a short chapter. That's interesting, don't you think? The author likes using far too many words. Oh, is that right, Pot? So he really must have run out of ideas for this one. After a small giggle to herself, Sana cleared her throat before starting to read once more. Though the realm of spirits is infinitely diverse, all those noted thus far have one thing in common. Their energy is ephemeral, and they will rarely affect a body for extended periods. However, there is one type of spirit that will not only invade, but overtake a human soul whenever they are given the chance. They are known as the Araphel, shades that lie completely beyond the realm of mortal understanding. I shall not write in detail of them here, for it is said that dwelling on the Araphel will often draw them to one's presence, and thus few have dared to document them. Once their attention is garnered, they will lure in their unsuspecting target without remorse, or more precisely, the target will be drawn to them inescapably, without realizing or understanding their own actions. My sole warning, then, is to avoid any study or investigation of these spirits. Do not trifle with the darker workings of nature, no matter how alluring their call may be. I'm gonna research them. Some aspects of the unseen world are meant to remain untouched. After she finished reading, the parlor grew chillingly silent. For a moment it felt as if the fire's warmth had vanished, and the only thing staving off the cold air was Sana's small form huddled against Esther. Neither of them immediately spoke. Both of their gazes were still drawn to the single page, lying open beside its empty, bone-white twin. Unlike most of the other chapters where Isaiah had lined the margins with his scribbled comments, this chapter was completely devoid of any such notes. The only mark he'd left was a dark, bold outline under the very first mention of Araphel. Its thick ink blot beside it suggested his pen had lingered there for a time. Either he'd been deliberating about writing more, or else he'd simply gotten lost in thought. The Araphel. It's a pretty name, but the way he describes them, it's really eerie. Sana finally broke the silence, her hesitant voice barely above a whisper. What do you suppose it means, Esther? Could they have something to do with the Pale? She offered no reply for a long moment. A murky, uncertain feeling shifted briefly in the back of her mind, before she pushed it away, annoyed at her own bothersome insecurities. I don't believe in whatever he's talking about. Even if spirits like that existed, there's no reason why they'd be related to the Pale. It's a disease of the body. You can ease the symptoms with a tonic, not with a priest warding off spirits. The more she voiced her thoughts aloud, the more firmly Esther believed them. The lure of superstition had only tempted her in a moment of weakness, and her impatience to find a cure. But I'll still keep looking for Isaiah's notes on them. His research on spirits might have led him somewhere else important. You're right. Maybe Papa found another lead. Something more, sturdy. It was easy to see the doubt on her face. Sana's like, I've played a video game before. I know where this is going. Get your ghost hitting stick. We're going hunting. Did Sana really believe in such things? She was younger, of course, but still far more intelligent and mature than most girls Esther knew. It wasn't simply a case of a naive child being afraid of ghosts. She's not like the other girls. Why then would she give any credence to such far-fetched writings? Esther just couldn't understand it. Because I'm a ghost. Ooh, let's look through something else. Yes, let's. In a brief moment of awkwardness that followed, Sana cleared her throat a little nervously, before pausing with a shy, slightly embarrassed smile. Jesus! Holy adjectives! A brief moment. A little nervous. Cleared a little nervously. That's two adverbs. Pausing with a shy, slightly embarrassed smile. 3! Ding, 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 3 of a kind. Can I ask you a favor, Esther? I'd really like to read one of Papa's journal pages, but... No. Well, like I said yesterday, he always told me not to. You're adopted. Not happily. She twirled a few strands of hair around one finger, letting out a rueful laugh. There were lots of things he was ashamed he'd written, he said, but he didn't want to throw them away. He needed to remember what he'd written and thought about, so that he'd never make the same mistakes again. You know, I don't think that was going to be an issue at that point. I don't know which journals are ones he wouldn't want me reading, but maybe you could look over one quickly and see. Of course. After briefly hesitating, Esther nodded. She was happy to do anything to repay Sana's many kindnesses, but after reading Isaiah's past journal entries, they seemed like they might be more painful for Sana than anything. Let's see here. Your father didn't love you. Picking up, and maybe not your biological father. Who knows? Picking up a few bound pieces of parchment from the pile, Esther quickly scanned over the pages, searching for any mention of Sana that might upset the other girl if she read it. Fortunately, though, the entry she'd picked up seemed unrelated to family matters. It looked more like a hastily, angrily scribbled scrant, the penmanship even messier than Isaiah's normal writings. This one. Shall I read it for us? Oh, yes, please. Society, am I right? Resting her chin on Esther's shoulder, she peered curiously at the frenzied scribbling. With a deep inhale, Esther slowly began to read Isaiah's words aloud. Just like I'm doing. Earlier today, I was reflecting upon my departure from the Academy's medical circle, and back to the southern accent. At the time, it was such a difficult decision, such an agonizing farewell. Now, however, I look back upon those times with awe, wondering how on earth I ever survived in such a place. I was constantly delegating research and experiments to different departments, and yet nearly every completed task would always return to me with some issue. The use of faulty tools or sloppy documentation, contaminated materials, careless omission of important details, it exasperated me to no end. Even the purported finest of researchers with the most spotless of records always seemed to deliver a perfunctory performance. Perfunctory is a good word. Then whenever I would bring my unsatisfying results before the head, he acted as if he didn't care in the slightest. On occasion, he'd echo my complaints with sympathetic tutting and the shake of his head, but in the end I gathered he simply had no investment in the results. Much of the time, the head went so far as to defend their mistakes, only stop at the edge of calling me an outright fool for caring as much as I did. Any problems I encountered were mine to resolve. Every issue would be solely mine to bear. Frustration brought me to the edge of breaking down over and over again, and only my damned refusal to concede would pull me back from the brink. And certainly, perhaps I am far too financial and needlessly worried. Finical. I don't know that word. And needlessly worried about the fine details. Despite my vanity, I realize I can be hopelessly stubborn at times. Damn, I'm so humble, like the most. But is it such a crime to strive for the best performance one can achieve? To care so passionately for beautiful results, a delicate procedure, a loving attention to detail? Can I rightly be called mad for my longing to make my envisioned perfection into a reality? Or, if not perfection, then its very closest sibling, a masterpiece of planning? No, I see with lucid eyes, leaving that hive of mediocrity which is truly a blessing in disguise. Whatever I could accomplish alone will no doubt be far smaller in scale than anything I could have done at the Academy, this I realize. But in the end, to be truly pleased with one's work, it must be solely a product of one's own design. And somehow it brings me an odd, unexpected comfort in these long days of solitary research and study, knowing I shall have no one to blame but myself when I am dissatisfied. What do you got to say, kids? Smile. To Esther's surprise, as soon as she finished reading, Sena broke out into warm, delighted laughter. That, it just sounds so much like Papa. The little rants he would always go on about over dinner. He always took himself and his work really impossibly seriously. Never any slacking, always beating himself up over his mistakes. Making sure to let perfect be the enemy of good. It brings back so many memories. Slowly the bright, affectionate smile, it's like the ninth smile, on her face began to wane. She seemed to be struggling to keep herself cheery in the face of whatever she'd remembered, but it appeared to be a losing battle. Sena, your father. Hesitating, Esther bit her lip. You don't have to answer, but could I ask what happened to him? Well, what do you think? He fucking died from the pail. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked. No, it's fine. Sena reached out, placing her small hand on Esther's arm reassuringly. In a way, the faint smile that she wore seemed almost grateful, as if something she'd wanted to talk about but hadn't been able to bring up. At first, I didn't realize he was gone. That morning, I woke up and started the day like usual, making a meal for both of us. I put Papa's on a little tray and brought it upstairs, planning to leave it outside his door, tell him I loved him, and then go start my chores. But an involuntary shudder went through her, briefly interrupting her halting, quiet words. When I reached his study, I saw the door was open. For a moment, I was so happy. I thought he was finally recovering and he could come play with me and work outside again. But he wasn't in his study, or anywhere in the manor, or outside in the garden. It's like he had just vanished into thin air. He became a ghost! When I realized Papa had disappeared, I was so scared. For 3 days, all I did was search for him, everywhere I could. I didn't return to the manor at all. I only ate some berries and roots, drank from the stream, and slept on leaf beds. But I never found anything, not a single trace. As she spoke in ever fainter, trembling voice, her fingers curled tightly in the fabric of Esther's sleeve. It was evident from her slightly choked words that she was holding back tears as much as possible. Like I did when I read the sad dog part of what comes after. Finally, I came back home. I didn't know what to do. It seemed like the end of everything. I thought I would die of starvation, or sickness, or from being alone for the rest of my life. Don't forget, I'm devastatingly lonely. I didn't even have any tears left to cry. I just stared at Papa's door for hours and hours, wondering if I'd wake up from a bad dream. The only time I moved was when I heard a rustle from outside, hoping and praying it was him, but it never was. When night came, I couldn't sleep. I hid under my blankets and listened to the floorboards creaking, over and over. She swallowed. For a long few moments, Sena was silent, but it was clear she wasn't quite finished, as Esther remained quiet. Then one night, I was so exhausted that I couldn't stay awake anymore. I fell asleep, a deep sleep, the kind where it feels like you've only just blinked your eyes. And when I woke up, the sun was shining so brightly through my window. I can't explain it, but I felt like it was telling me to keep living. To keep Papa's memory alive by protecting all his hard work. The manor, the gardens, the cemetery. He did so much to make us happy here. And on his desk, when I was cleaning it, I found everything he'd left for me. Special almanacs, maps, and guidelines, and some gold coins in case of an emergency. It really made me believe that he wanted me to go on without him. He didn't want me to give up. So I didn't. She finished with a numb, almost featureless expression. It stood in contrast to the optimistic nature of her words, as if she didn't fully believe them. At first, Esther couldn't think of any possible reply, so she just gingerly curled her arm around Sena, giving her a small comforting hug against her side. In response, the blonde girl rested her head on Esther's shoulder. She took a few shuddering breaths, squeezing her eyes shut for several moments, then reopening them with a long exhale. Sena. Her voice melded with the steady crackling of the fire, as low and gentle as possible. the question on the tip of her tongue. She didn't want to distress Santa any further, but the story seemed so incomplete. She couldn't help it. She had no choice but to ask. Are you certain that your father has really passed on? Couldn't it be that he just went back to the city? Santa stared with heavily lidded eyes at the gray window pane, where the distant stormy sky still showed no sign of clearing. A long silence passed between them, but just as Esther began to wonder if Santa had heard her question. Before he disappeared, Papa was that is a face. He was sick. I don't think he wanted to be alive anymore, even if he was afraid of death. I don't know how, but I just knew. I knew he was gone, so I stopped looking for him anymore. When I accepted it, I grieved for him for a long, long time, until I could finally move on. Trying not to burp into the mic. With Sana's cheek on her shoulder, Esther could feel the warmth of the small droplets falling against her blouse. There's a good one. Silently, she held the smaller girl close, listening to her breathing as it slowly grew less uneven. She couldn't say anything that would truly express the sorrow she felt for Sana. No platitudes or even words of comfort would do it any justice. There were some things that could only be shown through the warmth of a lasting hug. A reminder that someone else was there, understanding how much it hurt, even if they couldn't fully comprehend the way it felt. But in the end, it never seemed like enough. Finally, after what felt like a very long while, Santa slowly straightened up. It's been approximately a long while, so let's wrap this up. I'm sorry, Esther. We were supposed to be going through Papa's books and notes, weren't we? She gave a small, sheepish laugh, brushing some of her hair behind one ear. But thank you. For listening, I mean. It really helps. You don't have to thank me. When Esther shook her head somberly, Sana's smile actually brightened a little. The sadness in her eyes was still apparent, but it also seemed slightly less heavy than before, in a way. Well, I'm going to thank you anyway. I suppose the better things would be going over more research together, wouldn't it? There's still a lot left in the piles. Only if you feel well enough to. I do. Let's go through these first, shall we? Picking up another stack of parchment, Santa laid the pages out on her lap, shuffling some of them over to Esther. At first it felt a little awkward to start up working again after their talk, but the rustling of papers and rhythm of their murmured reading helped restore a comforting atmosphere. To their disappointment, however, they soon realized that none of the other papers were Isaiah's journals. Instead, they seemed to be his esoteric, incomprehensible notes taken from various books, scientific theories mixing in with the long ramblings of the supernatural. At one point, the fire's warmth combined with the coziness of their slow-paced, quiet reading started lulling both girls to sleep. Without even realizing it, they ended up slumping at opposite ends of the sofa, dozing out peacefully. When they awoke an hour or so later, they were equally hungry. Lunch had been forgotten in the midst of their engrossed work. But Esther was more than happy to help Santa in the kitchen, and together they cooked up a well-deserved meal of savory porridge with roasted vegetables. The two girls ate together mostly in contemplative silence, their thoughts preoccupied by Isaiah's books and writing. Delving into his journals had left a heavy, uncertain weight in the air, alongside the guilt and morbid fascination of uncovering dead secrets. Esther had no idea if Isaiah would have wanted his writings to be examined by a stranger, one who was mainly searching in her own self-interests at that. But Santa surely knew him better than anyone else, and she seemed just as eager as Esther to explore what her father left behind. It appeased a little bit of Esther's guilt, although she still had the sense of treading somewhere private, intruding on intimate thoughts that were only written down in an attempt to lighten their burden. After their meal, they returned to comb through more of Isaiah's research. But again, they met with little success. There was one thing of interest, however. In some of the books and scattered notes and spirits, Esther noticed an unsettling trend. Torn papers and large blacked out lines. It almost seemed like Isaiah had hunted down specific passages and attempted to erase them, but in an erratic, frenzied manner that went beyond even his normal messiness. In an eerie coincidence, she couldn't find any other mention of the Arafel. Perhaps it had just happened to be missing from the book she'd brought down, though an ominous sense in her gut made her wonder if that was really the case. Something strange had happened here, and the more Esther pondered it, the more she burned with a desire to explore Isaiah's unraveled mind. The Arafel. That's my joke. I'm sorry, Esther, but I don't think I can read another word tonight. If it were more than just an hour into the stream, this would be a wonderful place to stop. But I'm going to keep going. Surrendering to a long, exhausted yawn. It's like magic. Sana stretched her arms out over her head. I don't think I can either. It's not exactly light reading. You can say that again. It's not exactly light reading. My brain feels like it's jumbled up from all that fancy writing. They really use 100 times more words than they have to, don't they? You're calling yourself out. Maybe it makes them feel smart. Hold on, I'm just gonna print screen that for later. Nah, I'm not. Well, it makes me feel bored. They really need to think about their audience more. What, do you want more adjectives? She put on a playful pout, dangling her legs over the side of the couch. With a soft thud, her foot absent-mindedly hit the side of Esther's satchel. Uh-oh! It's time for drugs! It's time for time drugs! Which was still resting on the floor. Sorry, I knocked it over. Here, let me pick this up. You don't have to. It's fine, really. But Satan was already on her knees, scooping up the small trinkets and notes that had fallen from the pack. Is this your watch, Esther? Is this your naughty drugs watch? It's very pretty. I'm going to click this button. Picking up the silver timepiece from the ground, Santa turned it over in her hand, studying it with curiously shining eyes. Don't touch that. All of a sudden, Esther found herself deeply uncomfortable. It's not a normal watch. It holds my medicine. The watch part is only for tracking the time between doses. Doses? What do you... Reaching down, Esther picked up the silver timepiece from Sena's outstretched palm. Then, with her thumb atop one of the buttons, she pushed until the metal relented with a short, sharp click. Sena's eyes widened when the watch's back popped open, revealing the cruelly glittering needle hidden inside. The sight of it seemed to both repel and fascinate her, but most of all, concern welled in her gaze as she glanced up to Esther. You inject yourself with that? Yes, every night. And what happens if you don't? My muscles will slowly grow numb and give out altogether. At that point, I'll still be conscious, but it's only a matter of time before I will be comatose. It's possible to survive the paralysis for a short time, but if I don't quickly get another dose, my heart will stop. All the injection does is hold the threat at bay. It will always be there, no matter what. The fatigue of the pail is not really tiredness. It's a growing catatonia kept frozen in its earliest stage, before you lose the ability to move. She could hear her own calm, detached voice echoing in her ears, describing the effects in the same clinical way she had so many times before. That's so terrible. I'm so sorry, Esther. After a moment, Esther gave her a small shrug. To her, it was largely just another part of existence, a bodily need she had to deal with, like eating or sleeping. Of course, she longed to be rid of it, but after dealing with the pail for so long, she could barely remember what life felt like without its weight. We're going to find it. A cure for the pail, a way to set you free. I promise to help you, Esther. I'll do anything I can. I mean it. We'll find a cure, some way or another. I know we will. Until I disappear. Ooh. As grateful as she was to hear Sena's firm, determined words, her inner doubts refused to lift. It was too easy to begin to believe in empty reassurances. Oftentimes they only made a later disappointment far worse than before. But she would never voice such thoughts to Sena. Thank you. Judging from how the smaller girl's features grew slightly crestfallen, Esther hadn't hidden her lack of faith as well as she'd thought. After a long moment, though, Sena composed herself again. Well, you've done quite a lot today for being stuck inside, haven't we? Even though we napped, I'm still so tired. You should sleep then. I'm tired too. You're probably right. I don't think I'd be of any more use reading these books tonight. At least the rain stopped. It should be a lovely fresh day tomorrow. I hope so, anyway. Sena combed her fingers through her messy hair, letting out a sigh. Briefly, her gaze shifted over towards the watch still in Esther's hand. It's been a while, but that's number 20, baby! That's towards number 20. I need to use the bathroom. I'll be back in a moment. Okay, I'm back. Briefly, her gaze shifted over towards the watch still in Esther's hand, and that was number 20 for the towards count. And also, like, you really need to clean that needle. If you're not going to replace it, you should at least clean it. A flicker of worry and something almost like frustration reflected in her eyes. I hope you can rest well, Esther. I'll see you in the morning, all right? Esther nodded. Her fingers folded over the cold metal in her palm, masking it somewhat self-consciously. Thank you for your help again. Good night. No need to thank me. It was fun reading together, really. Well then, good night. With a gentle wave, she turned to make her way back upstairs, like always. When she was gone, Esther pulled out her nightshirt and began to change, savoring the loose and cozy warmth of her new makeshift pajamas offered. She'd already settled into a comfortable bedtime routine, and part of her enjoyed pulling over her heavy blankets each night, making a pleasant nest for herself. But somehow, when she finally sat back down and clicked open her watch, it seemed all the more difficult to bring its syringe to her arm. It wasn't as if she had a choice. The needle sank in, just like always, bringing a moment of relief before a wave of nausea crashed down on her and washed away any sense of comfort. Pulling it back with a shudder, she closed the watch as quickly as possible. Then, all but diving beneath her blankets, Esther curled herself tightly into a ball. We'll find a cure, some way or another. I know we will. If only it were easier to believe those strong, heartfelt words. If only she truly believed a cure existed at all. So what have we learned so far? Well, we've learned about ghosts and how much Isaiah hated his daughter. With an irritated click of his tongue, he threw his fine red quill into the desk. Why am I wasting my time with such foolery? It's impossible. The root must lie in an imbalance of the humors, of the body's chemistry. How can this fanciful nonsense possibly be of any use to me? Desperation truly does drive every man to the metaphysical. Muttering to himself in exasperation, Isaiah rubbed a hand over his bleary eyes. It felt as if he was constantly throwing himself at an impossible task, wasting his time on a labor that would never bear any fruit. A disease that was better off simply managed instead of ever truly cured. That was what all the literature pointed to, and he was nearly at the point of believing it. But somehow, a little spark of hope always remained within him. Presumably they found the tonic and whatever the fuck the watch is doing by trial and error, because, you know, humor theory, not exactly good science. As Isaiah leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifted over to the open window. He could see Sena's small shape in the distant flower patch, running to and fro as she entertained herself with her usual games of make-believe. She was growing so fast, a little bean sprout determined to reach the sky. He'd have to tailor some new clothes for her before winter, just as well, since he'd improved his sewing skills a great deal. It pleased him to sit and watch her at play. Such leisure was well deserved, since she'd performed excellently in her lessons today. Her intelligence at such a young age was certainly remarkable, though not wholly unexpected, since he had fathered her after all. Still, he found it difficult to not feel begrudgingly proud of the girl. She was already a voracious reader of the academic books he supplied her with, and although he had technically forbidden her from reading any of his grittier tomes of fiction, he pretended not to notice when they occasionally went missing. To his own surprise, Sena's cleverness had motivated him to take up writing again. In less than a year, he'd compiled a highly detailed almanac for her, penned in a straighter style than his normal academic ramblings. Perhaps he would make several more, since he was still learning the way of a forester's life himself. It was very important to him that she'd learned how to flourish alone, without relying on any urban comforts that would surely weaken her will. He wanted to impart as much of his knowledge to her as possible, in the hopes that absorbing it at an early age would help her always remain independent. As difficult as it would be for him to leave this world, knowing so much of his work was still unfinished, as long as Sena knew how to survive without him, when that fateful day arrived, he'd finally be able to let go. I'd rather you live alone in misery than go back to the city where the liberals are. Isn't that right, Isaiah? Ugh. A tightening, squeezing sensation in his chest jerked Isaiah back from his thoughts. Pushing back his chair, he rose swiftly to his feet. Ugh. Slumping against his desk, Isaiah barely managed to catch himself in time. The muscles and tendons in his legs felt as if they'd atrophied, or else were impossibly strained beyond the point of exhaustion. Where is it? He reached out with a trembling hand, grasping around for the presence of a small cold bottle. Soon his fingers brushed against it, yanking the flask towards him. 21. His medicine. The last dose hadn't been strong enough. Placing the uncorked bottle to his lips, he threw back the foul-tasting liquid. It stung the back of his throat, the sharpness of alcohol burning a path down to his stomach. But soon as the tonic filtered through his system, he felt a modicum of strength returning to his lower body. Despite the powerful ache, at least he could move for now. He needed strinky sippies. Picking up the roughly hewn cane that leaned against his desk, Isaiah slowly crossed his study. But before he reached his distastefully familiar bed, he paused, causing a sudden swift glance towards the window. 22. She was still there, dancing and gathering flowers, waiting for him to finally step out and join her. Disappointed, no doubt, when another bedridden day came and went. Playing alone as best she could, never complaining, never crying, not once. As if she were immune to every crippling pang of sadness. The sadness that you imposed on her with your no cities rule. Lowering himself onto his bed, he exhaled a long, weary sigh. This bitter frustration felt impossible to cling to for much longer. With each passing year, the strength of his will seemed to weaken further and further. Every burst of indignation and determined pride was always matched by the depressive slump of the aftermath. No, he wouldn't give up. He couldn't give up, not yet. But how much longer was this cycle sustainable? How much longer before his body and mind gave out altogether? There had to be an end, and yet all he could do was attempt to stave it off for as long as possible. Sena. Poor unlucky child. Mumbling to himself in a daze of exhaustion, he pressed his cheek against the pillow, staring into the wall with half-lidded eyes. A problem to which there was no solution. No exit other than to wait for sleep to come and relieve the burden for the rest of the day. Perhaps he would awaken with a little more energy, a little more inspiration, a little more hope. Or else it would all remain the same, until the cycle started over once more. This game makes me sleepy. Cool, crisp droplets coursed down Esther's cheek. The light breeze gently brushed past her face, turning the streaks of water into refreshingly cold trails that made her skin tingle. She shivered contentedly, swaying her feet in the water. Such a lovely morning. She couldn't remember ever seeing one like this at the city, or anywhere else in her long travels. The stream's light bubbling, the bright sound of the birds, sunlight delicately reaching through the trees. It was hard not to feel like everything was right in the world. Ah, I found it. I found it, Esther, look. Turning her head, Esther spotted a small figure running up alongside the stream. Was it Sena? In one triumphantly raised hand, she clutched a long ribbon that fluttered in the air behind her. Phew, I can't believe it got so far down the stream. Sena finally came to a stop beside Esther, still holding up the ribbon as she panted slightly. You look like a fisherwoman showing off her prized catch. Do I? Oh, Esther, look, it's alive. I think it's trying to hop back into the stream. As the wind made her ribbon flutter and ripple, Sena gasped, holding on with both hands like it was about to pull her into the water. Ah, no. Here, I'll help you. She rose to her feet, stepping over to grasp part of the ribbon. As if in response, the wind grew even livelier, making this thin strip of cloth dance frantically. Careful, this one's really strong. Don't let go, Esther. I'm counting on you. What's the wrong voice? I won't. Don't worry. I've been training all my life for this. The next moment, they both broke into a quiet fit of giggling, unable to stay serious any longer. It had been a few weeks now since Esther had first arrived at the manor. The days seemed to fly by so quickly that she could barely keep track. Between working and playing together with Sena, every hour felt so well spent, without a single gap for boredom to seep into. Since she'd gotten so caught up in their new routine, however, Esther hadn't spent nearly as much time researching as she needed to. In fact, the only thing she'd done was skim over a few shelves, and the incomprehensible writing she found often left her disheartened. After finishing her daily chores with Sena, she usually felt too tired to spend much time researching, but it was a pleasant tiredness, not the fatigue of those long bedridden days she'd often had before. Yeah, Esther, what did you think you were going to be able to do? Like, what's your medical knowledge, you know? Earlier that morning, after they'd had their morning tea together, Sena had told her of the day's plan. First, they'd wash their clothes, then gather some flowers and herbs outside the manor grounds before heading off to the cemetery. It felt strange at first to wear her nightgown into the forest, but Esther soon forgot about it. She was looking forward to having fresh, clean clothes again, and the stream's clear waters easily carried away all the dirt. Of course, they carried away one of Sena's ribbons, too, but luckily it now lay clasped between their fingers again. After they changed back into their dry clothes, the two girls set off towards the flower patch with their baskets. Slowly but surely, Esther had started growing more at ease in the deep forest. She no longer felt haunted by the anxious, wary feeling from when she'd first journeyed here, and the woods had seemed so daunting and unknowable. Of course, she didn't understand them half as well as Sena, and a part of her doubted she ever would. But at least the towering trees no longer felt quite as lonely in their vastness. Whenever I stumble on a sentence reading aloud and like, oh, I'm terrible at this, and then I remember my time in high school when half the class was functionally illiterate, and they'd be like, soon they reached the flower patch. Like, what was with that? Why were so many people so bad at reading aloud? Soon they reached the flower patch, its many blooms glimmering beneath the sun's radiance. It felt so warm and pleasant that Esther felt a strong desire to simply bask in it all. Unable to resist the urge, she did a little basking. She lowered herself down, sprawling out amidst the flowers like a contented cat. Good idea. Sena lay down beside her, mimicking Esther's relaxed stretch. I feel like I need to throw some water in my face to wake up. The gentle breeze lightly brushed over them, ruffling their freshly cleaned clothes and hair. It felt as divinely peaceful as any place could possibly hope to be, a dimension that lay beyond all earthly worries and duties. You said duties. For a long, euphoric moment, it seemed like every ounce of weight had lifted from Esther's body, and she was nothing more than a fragment of sunlight in the sky. Esther? After a few minutes, or perhaps many, Sena's voice drifted out of the unhurried silence. I was wondering, could you tell me more about the city? That evil, vile place my father told me never to go to? What your life there is like, I mean. The question caught Esther off guard. It pulled her back from her airy, dreamlike thoughts, tethering her to reality again. Since she'd started living with Sena, most of their conversations had been light and topical, and if anything, Sena had actually avoided asking about the city. But once her initial surprise had faded, she found her reply rising to her mind with unusual ease. Perhaps a part of her wanted to share more of her life with Sena. The city is static, efficient and industrial, but always the same. Academics and engineers say they're making advances every year, but in the end, life never really seems to change. It felt so strange to look back on her home now. Here, deep in the forest, those cold steel towers seemed like a distant fantasy, not something that even existed in the same world. There are people from different classes. The wealthy, the poor, the in-between. They have very different lives and very different senses of what's normal. But no matter how much money you have or don't have, everyone still suffers in their own ways. Getting a new device to keep track of time or warm the house changes things on the surface, but in the end, it never really helps people's pain. It only gives it a new name and a different form. When Esther described the city like this to someone who'd never seen it, it sounds so bleak and hollow. A place no one would surely want to live in if they could help it. Was that how she truly felt too? No matter how much technology we have, none of it can help with finding a cure for the pale. You don't know that. We're as helpless against it as we were from the beginning. Yay, do you think the same thing about the pox? Because that got cured pretty well. Maybe if you learned a little germ theory. The only thing we can try to do is try and abate the symptoms. Esther's voice gradually trailed off into a subdued murmur. The breeze drifted over them again, carrying away the last traces of her words, but not the weight of futile hope that they left behind. Something about the beautiful clear sky brought a deep melancholy to her heart. A carefree purity above all sickness and despair, all the more lovely for how untouchable it was. And in the city there are other people who are not like you and you have to coexist with them? Gross. I want to live alone. The pale. I'm sorry, I don't understand it very well. After a long pause, Sena finally spoke up again, sounding unusually shy and hesitant. Papa told me it affects everyone differently. Some people don't show many signs at all, but others are always very sick. What's it like for you, Esther? I mean, only if it's alright to ask. Although Sena hastily assured her, Esther realized she didn't want to stay silent, like she normally did when asked such a question. She never truly explained the feeling before, but now the desire to share it with somebody almost overwhelmed her in its intensity. The pale came to me around 4 years ago. A few months after I lost a tournament, one that was very important to me. At first, when I started spending days in bed from exhaustion, I thought I had just caught a common illness. But after the days of tiredness kept stretching on, and no doctor could find anything wrong with my body, I realized what it really was. For me, the pale it's like a parasite. I can feel it inside me, draining my energy, stealing my mind away from things I want to do to focus on. It's like a ghost! You've got ghosts! There are good days and bad ones, but sometimes even speaking feels like it's impossible. The medicine helps, but it feels like it's gotten less and less effective since I started taking it. Her fingers drifted to the small puncture spot beneath her sleeve, where the flesh had grown slightly discolored and permanently tender. Since she'd started injecting herself, Esther had always worn long sleeves to hide the mark, even when it grew warm outside. Back when I was studying at the academy, I struggled with the pale for my last 3 years. The teachers who had mentored me, the ones who'd always doted on me, I saw them pull away when they realized I couldn't accomplish anything more. Even my friends there started separating from me, thinking I was someone who'd only drag them down. My results slipped more and more, and by the time I finished, I'd lost any chance of becoming a researcher I'd dreamed of being. I didn't want to go back and study more, or start an apprenticeship for another trade that I would only fail at. My parents kept telling me that I should settle for simple work, or find someone who'd support me, but I hated both of those ideas. I wanted to make my own life. I promised them I'd find a cure for myself within a year, or at least something that would help my symptoms more than the medicine did. But even though I'd searched far and wide, and met many different people, and saw many kinds of advanced medicine, nothing worked for me. As she spoke, her mind flitted back to her many travels. The odd jobs she'd worked, the fascinating books she'd found in old libraries, the doctors and shamans who'd come from varied walks of life, and how restless she felt now, looking back on those times. And every time I thought I'd found something, and I started latching on to hope for a cure, it always ended up as another empty promise. And now the year I'd given myself was almost over. I could keep searching, but I don't have the will to continue after so much failure, finished the thought in her head. Something she couldn't bring herself to say aloud. I need to go back home. I don't want to abandon my parents, and I can't keep wandering forever. I had my chance, and if I failed, then I have to move on. Esther did her very best to make her voice sound firm and resolute, but she couldn't keep a note of sorrow from sinking in at the end. No matter how much she tried to tell herself otherwise, the prospect of returning home filled her with dread. So the rumor about Papa's research, that was your last hope? Yes. When Santa finally questioned her after a long pause, Esther bit her lower lip briefly. I don't want to go back to my parents empty-handed. I don't want to tell them I lost. A somber, heavy silence weighed over them, out of place among the beautiful skies and singing birds. Esther felt guilty for sharing such dark thoughts with her friend, but at the same time, it lessened her burden a little when she voiced them, no matter how hopeless the situation was. No trauma dumping! She could tell Santa was truly listening to what she said, and her quiet sympathy brought Esther more relief than she expected. I'm starting to slip on a lot of the sentences now. After an hour and a half of going at it. That gives me the yawns. Alright, that's a fine stopping point. I'm yawning and messing up my sentences and such. This seems like an hour and a half at a time kind of game. So let's drop a fat save. And I can close the game. That's it for today. Let's check what's for tomorrow. That would be Gum Gem or Gun Gem or Jum Gem. Probably Gum Gem. Let's see here. What was this? It's a platformer. Looks good. The evil gummy bear has taken the prince prisoner. Can't let that happen. See you then.